Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Inferior Data Part 4, looking at the troubles of observational studies, studies that are not experimental and do not involve manipulation and usually do not involve randomization or controls to the extent of an experiment. Data from such studies are quite prevalent. In fact, my guess is if you're doing risk management, most studies that provide data, the basis of which you will use to determine risk, are observational studies, not experimental, randomized controlled trials. And so the question becomes, are these studies useful? Do they tell us something? Or are there shortcomings to them that we need to take into account before we assess whether a risk truly exists or not? In order to do this, I'm going to motivate this in this lecture and the next couple of lectures by a series of 4 or 5 case studies where we will look at various examples of observational studies and critique whether in fact we have good knowledge as a result of those studies. One of the main points to make about observational studies is there is no manipulation in them. It's not an experiment. We're not controlling as scientists one specific factor, testing to make sure that the removal or presence of it actually contributes to some effect. And for that reason, observational studies do not fall within the mantra that we said before of no manipulation, no causation. And so we need to keep that in mind for all observational studies. And yet the paradox is this is the type of study that we most often will find when we have risk analysis. Let's get started. So I first want to just create a chart about what it is that we're trying to distinguish when we look at experimental studies versus observational studies. And there's usually two sort of main points to make here, and I'm going to show this slide again at the conclusion of this talk, but this is the punchline for today's discussion. Number one is that for experimental studies, causal inferences are usually possible. We're able to know something when we do an experiment, and that's why we do experiments, to gain causal knowledge. By contrast, observational studies usually are very difficult to achieve causal inferences from. It's not strictly possible for the reason that they have not completely eradicated chance, confounders, and bias, the things that we're always trying to control whenever we're dealing and gaining knowledge of causation. The second thing that comes up when we're dealing in an experimental study, and this leads off from the first one, is that experimental studies, unmeasured confounders are usually either balanced out and eliminated by randomization or by otherwise the design of the experiment. So we don't have to worry about confounders and to the most extent chance or bias when we're dealing in experimental studies. By contrast, confounders are not balanced and there usually is not randomization, and reverse causation usually cannot be ruled out when we have an observational study, as you'll see in some of the examples we'll talk about now. So for that reason, observational studies, while I don't want to completely categorically say are inferior in design to experimental studies, usually that's the case, and we need to take a certain degree of caution when we're looking at an observational study before we conclude that in fact we have any causal knowledge whatsoever. So the first example I want to give of a causal story that was told was the Scandinavian painter's syndrome, using almost purely observational science that led to very, very strong interventions to prevent this so-called syndrome from occurring. The basic idea was that painters were inhaling solvents and other sorts of chemicals in the process of painting and becoming impaired mentally as a result. This process took on its own life over a series of time, and let me talk to you a little about the scientific process that occurred and then the policy process that tagged along and sort of juxtaposed itself on top of this historical scientific process. So, first in the 1940s, in India, psychiatric manifestations were observed among workers working in rubber toy manufacturing, where they would paint the toys. And so the vulcanization and the viscose rayon industries in India noted some impairments in psychiatric maladies or disorders among the workers there. Nothing formal, just sort of some case reports that got written up. In the 1950s, there were subjective complaints published in various scientific literature, such as in 1955, by workers who were exposed to solvents like TCE and other things of that nature. So workers working around solvents complained of having fuzzy-headedness or lightheadedness and so forth, and these reports got published. Then there started to be industry-sponsored studies. Some of the chemical manufacturers and other sorts of industrial manufacturers were worried, is there something going on with our workers that we need to be concerned about? And so they sponsored various studies. And indeed, those studies tended to demonstrate that there was an acute but transient decrease in neurological functioning when you had very high exposure levels to various solvents. So in the short term, they found that there was slight mental or memory impairments in their workers as a result of very high dosages only over a short period of time, and these effects reversed themselves. But then in the 1970s, there were a series of Scandinavian studies of this issue that came up. And in Finland, for example, people had neuropsychologic tests that were given to rayon and viscose workers, the same groups that were working in India back in the 1940s, who had been exposed to the chemical of carbon disulfides. And that they found in these studies neuropsychologic impacts on workers, that they had mental impairments, slowness, and so forth as a result of these exposures. Now notice, these were not experiments. There's not a randomization going on where they'd subdivided groups and exposed certain people to chemicals and not others. This was not a randomized blinded trial. This was simply taking data where they took people who worked in factories around these chemicals, tried to measure how much dose there was in these chemicals, and then also tried to follow up and see what were the mental impairments, if any, on sort of IQ tests or other types of neuropsychological performance tests for these workers. Hain in Sweden during the 1970s examined 52 house painters from the trade union register and found that house painters, like these rayon workers, had impairment. And so on took its own life that painters and people working around the solvents typically involved in painting were in fact becoming mentally impaired as a result of inhaling or being exposed to the paint solvents. And then in Denmark, Sorberg and Arlen actually published their first study, and they called this chronic painter's syndrome. So hence came the phrase painter's syndrome from this. And immediately following these studies in the 1970s, Scandinavian countries began to pass legislation saying, see, there's science, these observational studies have been done. We went and looked and we found that painters tend to have lower IQs. And as a result, we're going to create a condition, and they called it, rather than painter's syndrome, a fancy phrase, chronic toxic encephalopathy. A clinical, legally recognized entity that allowed these people to get pensions, allowed them to sue potential manufacturers of paints, and so forth for their conditions. And then in the 1980s, there became a very well-regarded study by a man named Gade, who performed routine examinations and set out protocols for evaluating workers who were exposed to these chemicals as part of a financial compensation package for damages. So in other words, they created a gradient, and here's an example of this gradient here. North Carolina adopted these same measures in the 1980s that had been adopted in the 1970s in Sweden. And there were 4 or 5 different grades of the disorder actually given, where people would actually describe the symptoms that would come on as a result of paint inhalation. So in type 1, they would only have mild symptoms. Type 2, there would be sustained personality or mood changes as a result of that. Type 2B, there would be impairments in intellectual function and IQ, concentration, memory, and learning capacity. And in type 3, they'd have outright dementia. So there was a gradient scale put into place, not just as a scientific measure, but as a legal measure to ensure that these people, depending on what grade of the so-called disorder they had, would in fact receive compensation to a varying degree, either from the manufacturer or from the state. And so this took on a life of its own in the policy world, where it was taken for granted that this risk existed, and in fact was compensable and should be compensable as a result. Now, what was interesting about this was about the time that this had all occurred in 1985, and had really taken on a life of its own as a taken for granted form of legal cause of action to sue for painter's syndrome. and painters were flocking for these types of litigations or pensions. There was a study put out a year later by two individuals, Arebo, Knudsen, and Olsen. And what they said was, wait a minute, let's go back and look at the quality of these observational studies. Do we in fact know that using paints causes mental impairment? Now remember, if you think back to lectures we've had in the past on this, we need to control for all sorts of confounders that potentially could crop up when we're determining causation. Likewise, causation is directional. There's always the potential for reverse causation. Rather than asking the question, do we know that painting causes mental impairment, could it be that mentally impaired people are the type of people who self-select in order to become painters? Well, that's an interesting question. And so what Arebo, Knudsen, and Olsen did was they went back and looked at all the different studies that had been done, and they found that in all of these studies, there really had been nobody who had addressed this potential for directionality of the study. That is, was there a possibility that people who already had low-performing mental conditions were the kind of people who, just by their nature, tended to self-select to go into the painting industry, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised if we tested such individuals, even after they've been exposed to the paint, to find that they had lower mental function. And this is what was very clever about what Arebo, Knudsen, and Olsen did in a study in 1986. They went back in their Project Metropolit study and they looked at a group of boys in Sweden who had been studied as youth with a battery of tests. These were grade school children, and there were 11,352 boys in this study who had been studied extensively in school with a very wide battery of different mental neurological tests as youth. And 7,868 of them had had intelligence tested back in 1965, well before any of them ever became of any trade occupation in the future. And in 1971, 6 years later, it had been recorded that 71 of those boys entered the painter's trade. So here we have a very nice study, what's called prospective study, where we looked at the children's IQ and then tracked them in advance to know what their abilities were mentally, and then followed them into the workplace later into what sort of profession or trade they were. So we could then identify who self-selected to become painters as opposed to another profession. What Arebo, Knudsen, and Olsen noted as a deficiency of other studies that had been done was they said that it is a common feature of the papers we have reviewed that a large percentage of the painters included in the studies exhibited impaired mental function in a varying number of psychological tests employed. This is the whole point, is that mental impairment supposedly existed among painters. The authors of the papers state that the painter's premorbid intellectual function must be assumed to have been normal. In other words, nobody had ruled out the reverse causation prospect. As they had completed an average years of 7 years of elementary school and therefore a normal apprenticeship thereafter as painters, they said, if we looked at all the other studies that have been done thus far, nobody looks at reverse causation. Everybody assumes that because these painters went to elementary school, primary school in the United States, and they became apprentices as painters, we can assume they had normal mental function just like anyone else in society before they became painters. And it's only after they became painters that they had impaired mental function, which we purportedly ascribe to the solvents that they were using. When Arebo, Knudsen, and Olsen went back and actually looked at this, however, and here's this graph that has the longitudinal birth cohort of the Copenhagen boys born in 1953 that they had looked at in this study. And so their IQs were taken in 1965 and broken out by cohort. The average IQ was 68, and that they looked at the IQ score from 1 all the way up to 120, 120 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And then they broke it out because they knew what these boys did after they left school and joined apprenticeships in Copenhagen. And they found what people did by trade. And then they could break out by trade what the IQs in school of those boys had been prior to entering their trades. What they found was interesting, was that among people who went into painting, well over half, indeed 77.4% of those who became painters had IQs below the median IQ in school before they ever became painters. And so 28.2% of those were actually from the lowest IQ quintile, or sextile, I think it was, at that time, and none of them came from the highest sextile of the IQ population. In other words, the painters had IQs that were not randomly distributed. This is not like they were just ordinary people in the background population. They tended to come from the lower end of the mental functioning skill set prior to entering the painting trade. And so in looking at this, what they concluded was that it must be borne in mind that the painter's IQ was not normally distributed. This perhaps explains some of the abnormalities in the result of the psychological tests on painters' exposure to organic solvents. Reverse causation had not been ruled out. In addition to this, there are many confounders of neurobehavioral test performance that an observational study that simply looks at levels of exposure to paint solvents and subsequent IQ or neuropsychologic test performance are not controlled for, and are not controlled for because we have not done that randomized controlled trial. Here's just a few examples. I have about 45 of these, and I'll just click through these right now. You can see how many different types of confounders there are that are potentially interfering with the conclusion that painting, in fact, causes mental impairment. Things like age or premorbid IQ, which is the one we just looked at, education, sex or gender, caffeine usage, nicotine and smoking habits, drug abuse, prescription medications they're taking, circadian rhythms or whether they're doing shift work, coronary heart disease or high cholesterol, and it goes on. Metabolic diseases could potentially be in effect. Pulmonary conditions, neurologic diseases, neuropsychiatric diseases or mental illness, moods or depressions, current health status, head injuries, physical trauma to extremities, exposure duration to the solvent, which hand they use, occupational history. There become even still more things like sleep patterns, vocational training, word blindness or dyslexia, writing difficulties, reading ability, socioeconomic status, stressors, ulcers, race or ethnicity, computer experience and being able to take these tests. I'll give you more. Language, organ toxicity, arthritis, exposures from hobbies, current infections or viral conditions, job satisfaction, geographic location, hearing impairment, vision impairment, litigation status. This is an interesting one in the sense that maybe people who are litigating, trying to get money for their potential damages, have some sort of built-in bias or incentive not to perform as well on the test than those who are not suing. Or just because of the stress of litigation itself, they may have mental impairment. Nutritional deficiencies, social and cultural experiences, and birth trauma. So we see so many different confounders, many of which were never controlled for in any of these studies when we were looking at the suspected causal relationship of painting and mental impairment. And so in these observational studies, this is just one example of where many, many confounders, and we saw examples of confounders and descriptions of what confounders are before when we talked about determinism. What happened after the Knut Hobson and Olson study? Well, Gade, who had published the original study in 1985 that led ultimately to policymakers adopting litigation and pension funding plans on behalf of painters, actually retracted their study and said that we had not controlled for potential reverse causation and the confounders that were observed in this study. And here's some of their language that comes out of that paper. They say the present results, and by that they mean the studies in the Olson paper that looked at the boys' pre-exposure IQs in middle school and high school and found that painters tended to be those people who had lower IQs and thus self-selected to become painters, not the other way around. They found that our group of solvent-exposed patients were not intellectually impaired and thus not demented, but had been so diagnosed erroneously. Previous impressions, they said, of significant intellectual impairment in the solvent-exposed patients could not be confirmed when the influence of age, education, and pre-existing intelligence was taken into consideration. The present group with presumed painter syndrome is assumed to be representative of other patients who were similarly diagnosed in our department. The presently reanalyzed cases done in this Olson study have been diagnosed as brain damage and reported as such in the literature. Thus, they may have contributed to the formation of the concept of the chronic painter's syndrome with dementia. These are important points coming up now. The most important outcome of the present reanalysis is disappearance of apparent and previously reported evidence of impairment in psychometric test scores. Once we take into account that these boys had lower IQs and lower psychometric functioning prior to entering the painting trade, we can't find any evidence that exposure to solvents lowers their IQ further, they say. In Denmark, the painter's syndrome continues to attract the affection and attention of the public media. The present results, they said, remind us of the dangers and pitfalls inherent in uncontrolled or poorly controlled studies, namely observational studies without manipulation or randomization. We suggest that future publications of studies based on neuropsychological test data in this and related areas be limited to reports in which the questions of control are adequately dealt with. In other words, the very people who had initially pushed for painter syndrome in the scientific literature to exist ultimately retracted their statement and said that carefully done observational work, noting that reverse causation had not been ruled out, using a longitudinal study which had never before been done, found that the assumed causation was not in fact there. And so an observational study ultimately failed, even though it had led to massive policy interventions prior to additional information that could have been found in advance coming to light. Here's a nice other slide I'd like to point out here. This is a slide that looks at the trend in positive or negative findings of painter's syndrome. That is, the yellow marks are where positive studies were found to exist, confirming the relationship between painters and painters' mental impairments and the use of paints. And the blue studies are studies that found no, there is no such relationship. What's interesting is initially on the left-hand side of this graph, which is the early years, there's lots of positive studies being found. Oh, yes, 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 we're finding lots of these confirmed relationships, all observational studies note, but we're finding, in fact, this relationship to exist. And then once the Olson study came out in 1986, which pointed out that reverse causation had not been convincingly ruled out, and they, in a way, nicely showed reverse causation as a potential confounder, all the studies started to trend negative. Well, why is that? Why should the studies all of a sudden become negatively published as opposed to positively published before? The science is the science. I think part of the reason is people tend to jump on the bandwagon, particularly with observational studies, which are easy to do and not well controlled for confounders, bias, and chance, when in fact, once we know by a more experimental condition whether reverse causation has been ruled out, people start to then find observational studies in the opposite direction. It shows that observational studies are oftentimes more artifacts of opinion than they are of scientific fact. So coming back as a conclusion to today's lecture to the slides we talked about before, experimental studies really give us causal inferences, but observational studies don't really make this possible, or at least not strictly possible, although we'll see some that approach that level in the future. Unmeasured confounders, bias, and chance in experimental studies are either balanced out by randomization or by the design of the experiment. Those are not balanced or eliminated when it comes to an observational study. And for that reason, I call observational studies a source of inferior data, hence the title of this lecture, Inferior Data Part 4, talking about observational studies, which is the vast majority of what you will read as cited proof of causation and thus of risks when you do risk management. We're done for today. See you in the next class.